What is the gospel? In our culture, I feel like that the gospel, or there's more confusion rather about what the gospel is in our culture, possibly more than any other time, save for the first few hundred years of the Christian faith. And the reason I say that is because, you can hear my kids talking in the background. The reason I say that is because I feel like the gospel has become so intertwined with media representations or political organizations. In other words, just that the culture is so berated or come into contact with or influenced or misrepresented or given a different perception, or just there's so much out there about what is it that Christians even believe that the gospel is. Is the gospel just simply doing good things and loving people, whatever that even means? Of course, no one ever wants to define what it even means to love someone. Is it that? Is it changing the laws? You know, arguing for certain types of legislation within culture? Is it what is it? What does it mean to say that someone follows Christ? What is it that someone? What does it mean to say that someone is telling others of the gospel, or telling others of what Christianity is, or what even Christians believe? Now, the beauty of what we as Christians would say is the gospel, other than what it is in its essence, is just first the simplicity of the gospel. So with that said, what is gospel? Gospel just means good news. That's all that the word means, is good news. But as of others have pointed out, good news implies that there was, at least in some sense, bad news first, meaning that something is not going right. Then someone comes along and says, hey, I've got the solution here. Or, hey, listen to this. I've got something you really, really want to hear in light of this news over here, which was bad, or which was not good, which was not necessarily wanted in any shape, form, or fashion. And so the Christian gospel is a combination of both of these things. So how is it simple? How is the gospel simple? If we're all honest, we look at the state of man. We look, again, you don't have to be a Christian to recognize this. All of us look around and we see that something is wrong. Right? Something is wrong, whether it be in society, whether it be in culture, whether it be in the world, whether it be in the universe. And if we're honest with us, ourselves, something is wrong inside of us, meaning that we know that we ought to behave a certain way. We ought to do certain things. And even with the best intention, we end up not doing that. Right? We see someone on the side of the road. We see someone on television. We see maybe even our own family or our friends. In my case, even my own household. I know this way that I ought to behave. I know this way that I ought to do things, that I ought to go about my life. And I'm constantly falling short of that seemingly clear way in what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm not measuring up, so to speak. Now, again, is this to say that we're not trying, or that, oh, well, I try to do those things. Well, no, no one argues with it. Everyone knows that we're in some sense trying to do it. But the question is, or the issue is, are we? And if we look deep down, we know that we're not. Again, this is just one of those obvious things that we see. Again, if we watch the news, if we read any sort of literature that contemplates current cultural issues, something's not right. Christianity comes along, and this is the bad news before the good news. Christianity comes along and says that something that's not right is you, is me. In fact, we have something that attests to this, something that shows us that we know that that's true, and that is called our conscience or our guilt. Everyone, if they're honest, when they lay their head down at night on their pillow, we have this sense of guilt that there's a certain way that we ought to be and that we're not. We have this sense of guilt that when we treat other people in a way that we would want ourselves, that we would want to be treated, and we fail to do that, we feel guilty about that. Now, is that mere psychology? Is that just some sort of social adaptation? Because if it is, then you can just toss your guilt out the window. But we know that it's not that deep down. We know that we really are guilty. We feel, we existentially, we experience this sense of guilt that we ought to be a certain way, that we shouldn't have treated someone a certain way, that we ought not to have said a certain thing to a certain person at a certain time. And so we have this real moral weight that sits on our hearts, that sits on our minds. I mean, look at counselors and psychologists. Their schedules are full of people that are trying to figure out what to do with this guilt. Of course, that can be developed to an unhealthy measure, some sort of complex, but that's not what we're addressing. We're just talking about this real sense that we're not living in a way that we ought to live. And all of us have some way that we're trying to deal with that. Think about this. Every world religion tries to put its finger on or diagnose or even give an answer to or a fix for making things right. All world religions do this. Oh, well, yeah, there's this sense of guilt. This is what you do to act right. This is what you do to make that guilt go away. This is what you do in order to feel like you're living the right way. And again, and let me say this very clearly, even the non-religious, even those that don't practice any faith, are doing the same things. This is why you see secular humanist types or humanistic type organizations that are trying to feed the hungry or take care of the homeless or do whatever, because again, there's this sense of guilt that we ought to be living a certain way. And again, is this more than just a socio-biological adaptation or evolution? Because again, if it's that, then you can toss it out as just a byproduct of adaptation or evolution. And that's not to say that evolution's false. It's just to say that if that's all it is, then you really not need to worry about it any more than you need not worry about your appendix if it gets in the way of your lifestyle. But again, we know that it's not. We know that this sense of guilt really is true. Now, this is the good news. So that's the bad news, is that you and I have violated some real standard. In fact, we've not only just violated that, we've not only violated that standard. And again, if we're honest, we are openly in rebellion against that standard. Not only do we know that we ought not to be a certain way, and we've gone against that, but we've willfully chosen to go our own way. That is to say, in a very real sense, we've chosen to be our own God. That we define how we want to live. We decide what we want to do. But at the end of the day, we have this guilt that we know deep down that that's not right. And so Christianity says the bad news, as at the end of life, we'll be held accountable for violating that way, that moral standard that we know, that our entire lives that we knew that we were supposed to live by. We'll be judged by that. We'll be held accountable to that. And again, the bad news is that we'll have to answer and pay for that in what Christianity would call a separation from your Creator, a separation from God, a separation from the only one that is truly good forever. But this is why Christianity offers what's called the gospel, the good news. This is why Christians think that Jesus is so beautiful. That even though all of those things are true, that we've just said, all of that bad news is true, that God, that the Creator in his love for us came as a man. Jesus, the Son of God, came to be punished on our behalf. He came to pay for that moral guilt, that real sense of separation. He took that on himself on the cross, as Christians believe, and he paid for that. So, loosely speaking, he looks at the Father, he looks at God and says, I love this person so much that I'll take their punishment. If they'll only trust me, if they'll only throw themselves on me, if they'll only believe in me and let me live my life through them, Jesus says, then I'll take their punishment. And so, to satisfy God's requirement of justice, because God is perfectly good, he's perfectly just. And just like any good judge wouldn't excuse or simply dismiss a rapist or a murderer, if he's truly good, then that has to be punished. Even if he is loving, even if he is a forgiving judge, evil still must be punished if he really is good. And so Christ, Jesus, takes that punishment on himself so that you don't have to take the punishment, so that you don't have to pay for your own moral guilt, what Christianity would call sin, so that you don't have to pay for that, so that you don't have to be separated from your Creator, from God, eternally. So that if you accept Christ, that's what it means to accept Christ, that you trust him, that you give your life over to him in exchange for him paying for your wrong, that you will be reconciled to God, that you have a relationship, that you and he are reconciled to one another. And so in one sense, you are, in the truest sense imaginable, you receive forgiveness. You receive that guilt that, if you're honest, it dwells deep down within you. Again, that guilt that every world religion is trying to solve, is trying to diagnose, is trying to fix or correct. Christianity fixes that by taking it by the horns and saying, yes, we are guilty before a holy and a righteous Creator who made us to be a certain way that we've fallen from, that we are in active rebellion from. And so he takes that on himself and instead opens up forgiveness so that you can be forgiven, so that you can be in a right relationship, so you can be reconciled to the one that made you, your Creator, so that you can be reconciled to God through Christ. That's the gospel. That's the good news, is that you can have a real, authentic relationship with your Maker, with the one that made you, through Jesus. It doesn't mean that everything will work out perfectly, that you'll have perfect health. It doesn't mean that you'll have wealth. It doesn't mean that you'll get the fantastic job. It doesn't mean any of those things. It means that you will now be made right with God. And so I just don't want there to be any confusion as to what Christianity is. Now, Christians obviously have opinions on, just like every other group, what would be best for society, right? And this is part of living in a democratic republic. Your views, you're allowed to try to argue for those views in the public square, all those sorts of things. But that itself is not the gospel, right? The gospel simply is that you and I, as our guilt attests to, have disobeyed God, lived in a way contrary to God. And again, if we're honest, we see this. We recognize this. We recognize that something has gone wrong with humanity. And so the good news is that God wants to forgive you and love you. In fact, he does love you. That's why he came. That's why Jesus came, to die for you, even while you're in open rebellion against him. He died for you. He died for a rebel because he loves the rebel. He loves you. He loves me. So the exchange is, the offer is, you give him your life and he gives you his life. You come to him in your brokenness, with your guilt, with your shame, and he gives you, because of his sacrifice, because he died for you, he gives you his wholeness, his love, his forgiveness, his acceptance. With the only requirement being that you allow him to live his life in you and through you. That's the exchange. In one sense, it's free. It costs you nothing. To be made right with God costs you nothing. But in another sense, it's not free at all, because one, it cost God his son. It cost Jesus his life on the cross. And it will cost you giving up the autonomy that you want to live your life your way, that you allow Jesus to live his life through you. And that's the gospel. And it's the nuts and the bolts of the gospel is that. Of course, there's so much more that could be said in regards to Christian theology and teaching and doctrine, orthodoxy and orthopraxy, all that stuff. But the nuts and the bolts of the gospel is that we've done wrong, we've rebelled, we know it, and we need forgiveness. And Jesus offers that forgiveness to you through his work on the cross, through his dying for you. For the wrongs that you did, he died for, to offer you his life in exchange for yours.